I said, good evening. The first thing that we're going to do this evening is take a minute and consider the land and the place where this virtual broadcast is happening. So even though we aren't in person like we often are for Evening at Egan, we are virtual and we are hosted from Juneau. All of our campuses in UAS in Juneau, Ketchikan, and Sitka reside in Tlingit territory, and specifically our Auk Lake campus in Juneau is located on the land of the Aukwan people. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Aukwan and the greater Tlingit community, their elders, both in the past and the present, as well as future generations to come. So I just want us to take a few seconds and pause and hold that thought in our mind. All right. Thank you. So my name is Greg Sampson. I'm a faculty member at UAS. And this evening, it is really quite a pleasure and a privilege to introduce to the Evening at Egan, Libby Bakalar. Libby is an attorney, social justice advocate, an individual who is in the Alaska and Juneau landscape with a very strong social media presence, and definitely someone who people think of as a thought leader in a lot of ways. And so tonight, and Libby, you're also a mom too. I can say that, right? Is that okay to say?
Yeah, definitely.
So tonight, Libby is going to come and discuss with us some of her thinking on freedom of speech, First Amendment issues, and sort of the political climate that we're living in and experiencing. From her vantage point, I think across all three of these areas, a person who's deeply committed to social justice, a person who is an attorney and very knowledgeable of issues related to constitutional law, and as someone who really cares about the climate that we're all experiencing as humans. So after Libby engages in her discussion, she will open this up for a question and answer session. And then we are going to invite people to pose any questions that they might have to Libby based on her background and her expertise. So Libby, I'm going to hand it over to you now, and I'm going to turn off my video and I will enjoy this presentation as much as everyone else. No doubt this will be a fantastic session. Thank you for joining us, Libby.
Thank you. Thank you guys for having me. I hope folks can hear me okay. It's a little bit awkward doing this on Zoom. I've been struggling with I'm a social person, so it's been hard for me to get used to Zoom and doing all of this in person. So anyway, I appreciate everybody being online tonight to hear me talk. And I didn't really exactly plan on being here. I planned on being here obviously tonight, but I didn't plan on any of the things in my life that got me here, or being in a position really to be talking to you guys about free speech and advocacy and social media, and yet here I am. So that's what I'm going to talk about, and I'm sort of hoping this will be a pretty informal dialogue. I'm kind of hoping to have more of a dialogue with you guys than really talk at you the whole time. I tend to talk fast too, so if I need to slow down, just let me know. It's a New Yorker thing. Anyway, I want to keep the lecture and the storytelling part of this pretty short, and then I'm hoping we can have more of a discussion and kind of see where that takes us. Let's start with the Constitution. I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'm just going to be kind of freewheeling here. Without getting into a huge amount of historical detail about the Constitution, I just kind of want to lay out a general framework for how to think about the Constitution in 2020. The Constitution is really just a contract between the government and the American people. And at the state level, it's a contract between the state of Alaska and its people. And obviously we have a state constitution as well. And in a constitutional democracy, the focus is really on preventing the government from trampling on the rights of the people it governs. And those rights are set out obviously in the Constitution, and that takes the form of all sorts of protections, from the right to a fair trial, to the police needing to get a warrant to search your house, to what religion you practice or don't practice. And the First Amendment to the Constitution, which is sort of the general, the fulcrum of what we're going to be talking about tonight, is part of the Bill of Rights, adopted in 1791 after the Constitution itself was adopted in 1789. And I just, here's what it says, and I just want to read the whole thing because it's so short and yet so meaningful. And there's so much packed into it, yet it's so brief. And what it says is, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So there's a lot packed in there, a lot of the things that we as Americans take for granted about America in that one little paragraph. There's the separation of church and state in there. There's the free practice of religion and the freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom to hold the government accountable to the people it governs and to petition the government for redress. And so, all of these basic rights that, are just so endemic to our society are just packed into this one little tight, concise paragraph. And so I'm here mostly to focus on the freedom of speech part of it, not the other clauses. And I guess to some extent, freedom of the press, because that's what got me here. So I'll tell my story of how I got to this point, which is I have a big mouth, and I always have. I'm good at keeping other people's confidences and secrets. I do that for a living. But when it comes to sharing information about myself and my opinions, I'm pretty much congenitally incapable of shutting up, especially when I see what I perceive to be corruption, injustice, or bigotry out in the world. I got kicked out of class all the time in school for talking or making other people laugh. And I think I spent some portion of 3 out of every 5 school days on the couch outside the principal's office. And I'll never forget it. It was called the Green Couch. And it was this fake leather puke green couch where the bad kids went while they waited to get their talking to from Mr. Schaller, the principal. And, years later, I got into a screaming match with the dean of my law school in the cafeteria of my law school in front of maybe half the law school about the importance of law students giving poor people free legal help. And she thought they didn't deserve it. I thought they did. And so it was my mouth that got me here and was always a problem for me growing up. And I've also always loved to write. I come from a family of writers. My dad's a journalist. My grandma was a magazine editor. And I've just always used writing as an escape hatch and as therapy as well, as a way to make my living and communicate with people. So sometime in late 2014, when my kids were 7 and 4 I started just posting on Facebook about kind of the trials and tribulations of parenting. And my best friend Mally from grade school, she said to me, Libby, you are wasted in the law. You need to start a blog. And so I started my blog, and I called it One Hot Mess because I felt like those 3 words were just a perfect description for my entire existence. At the time, I was a full-time working mom, trying to balance my job as an assistant attorney general at the state Department of Law with my marriage and raising my kids. And I found that keeping sort of a public journal about a lot of that stuff in the form of a blog, an online blog, was kind of therapeutic. And I was really thrilled that people ended up liking it and it resonated with people. And I think the reason for that is because it was honest and it was authentic, and it was just me sharing all of kind of my insecurities and failings in everything from fashion to parenting, kind of with the world, in the hopes that it would make someone's day a little better, maybe make somebody laugh. Sometimes maybe I overstepped, but we all make mistakes. But anyway, pretty soon my blog amassed a pretty big readership, and I found that the more people read what I was writing, the more I wanted to write. And it was never a job for me. It was always just a hobby. I never, blogged on work time. I never had ads on my blog or got paid for it. I just did it for the joy of doing it. And I still do. And then, in late 2015, Donald Trump started his ascendancy to power. And I was just like, this has to be a joke. I mean, I grew up in New York City in the 80s and 90s. So I was familiar with his shenanigans, and I was like, there is no way this guy is running to be the referee of a high school soccer team, much less the president of the United States. I cannot believe this is happening. And that's sort of the first time, I guess, my blog took a turn to what you can call the political. And I started to branch out more kind of from parenting and fashion and food and music and lifestyle stuff to some more serious issues of social justice or making fun of Trump's latest BS or what have you. And that's when the state of Alaska, which was my employer at the time, started taking notice. And here I'll just pause to sort of, I think it's critical to point out here that the state of Alaska is the government. They're a government employer, which means that they have to comply with the state and federal constitutions with respect to their employees. You know, if I worked for Target and Target didn't like my blog, they could fire me tomorrow, regardless of my work performance. But when you work for the government can't fire you for the sole reason that you are exercising a constitutional right, with some limited exceptions that didn't and don't apply here. You know, most people don't check their constitutional rights at the door when they enter the state office building to work. So anyway, the state and you know, everything I'm talking about here is totally in public, newspaper, court filings, etc. They launched an investigation into my blog. And this was a year and a half or so before I was fired. One of my stalkers, because by now I had some stalkers, insisted that, you know, I was blogging on state time and my blog violated the Executive Branch Ethics Act. And anyway, she went to the newspaper and my bosses in the legislature and anyone who would listen because she didn't like my writing. So the state, you know, got a contract with a lawyer and they paid a lawyer $10,000 to investigate my blog. And that investigation resulted in what I already knew was true, which is that my blog was totally legitimate. I had every right to be having it. I hadn't done anything wrong. And I told the folks who, and my colleagues or superiors who said that this was happening, that you know, that they're free to investigate me, but I'm not going to sit here for the next 8 years and watch what's going to happen and not say anything about it. And this was, you know, before even the worst of the stuff that has happened, but I saw the writing on the wall. And so I was like, I'm not going to sit here and shut up, and I'm sorry, I'm just not. So, and, you know, by this time I was fairly senior at work and my personnel record was great. My work performance was great. The only problem was I had opinions and I wanted to write about them and I wanted to share them with the world on my own time. And at the same time, I was out at rallies. I could have had a rally punch card, honestly. I was going to the Women's March. I went to DC on my own dime to talk to Lisa Murkowski and Senator Sullivan on the Kavanaugh Supreme Court nomination. And I was kind of organizing and attending events to see, you know, what we could do about some of the family separations at the border. In other words, I was giving my First Amendment rights a serious workout. I was exercising those rights. So, you know, fast forward to December 3rd of 2019, and I get a call at my desk from my supervisors at work that Tuckerman Babcock, who was Governor Dunleavy's chief of staff at the time, told them to fire me. And they fired one other attorney, Ruth Botstein, who had just finished actually arguing a case in front of the United States Supreme Court. Now, understand too that by this time, my whole career and Ruth's had been spent defending Republican administrations for the state of Alaska. I and she, we had both been there since the Frank Murkowski administration. And, you know, never once did I or she blog or tweet or Facebook or post about a state issue. Not once in any of my time working for the state did we talk about our jobs. I talked about Trump, of course, and, you know, what an asshole I thought he was, but not about anything related to my job. I didn't do it then. I don't do it now. And neither had Ruth. And the only apparent reason we were being released from our jobs, which were non-politically appointed long-term career jobs, was because we were liberals who criticized Trump on the internet. So now, I mean, anyone who's following current events knows how powerful the internet and social media is. Our president uses Twitter daily to circumvent ordinary channels of governance. And in my opinion, if the president can do that, then certainly the citizens of this country can use social media to respond to what he's doing. So anyway, after I got fired, it was hard. I had a lot of time to sit on the grown-up version of the green couch and think about what I'd done. And I came to some basic conclusions, and these were really conclusions that I had come to before, but they were really starting to gel for me and come into focus. The first one was that, you know, we only have two tools in our lives that we have any real control over. One is our time, and the other is our voice. And the way we use our time and the way we use our voices determine the impact that we make on the world, whether it's, you know, our day-to-day lives or bigger macro political activist lives. And no one can take those things away from us. You know, people can take your house, they can take your job, your money, but no one can take your time, and no one can take your voice. And the second realization I had was that the Constitution wasn't really worth the paper it was written on if people like me didn't enforce it when it was violated. I mean, here I was, a lawyer who worked with the Constitution every day because I was a government lawyer. And if my constitutional rights were violated and I didn't do anything about it, you know, who would? And the thing about your constitutional rights is that they aren't like a medical condition. It's not like something where if you get sick, you don't go to the doctor, eventually you'll either get better or you'll die. If your constitutional rights are violated and you don't say anything about it and you don't do anything about it, it's truly like they never existed in the first place. And so I went to the ACLU and we filed a lawsuit because that's, you know, where you go to resolve a constitutional violation. You go to court. You know, legislature makes the laws, the executive branch enforces them, or in this case violates them, and the judiciary interprets the laws and determines the constitutionality of the actions of the other two branches of government. The third realization I had was that I had a big social media platform now, and it had become kind of a powerful currency, and I had to decide how I was going to use it. And I realized I had a certain power in my hands, and I needed to be conscious of the fact that, you know, what I say and do online has real life impacts. And so I needed to be more careful about checking my facts and linking to reputable sources, and basically, you know, continue to use the platform for all the things I had always done, you know, share funny stories about my life and all of that. But be conscious of the fact that my blog had morphed into more of an advocacy tool. And I'll give you an example of that. Through my blog, I had met a woman, and you guys may have heard this story in the news, a woman named Tammy Willis in Soldotna, who was the target of some LGBT hate crimes. And I really used my blog to kind of amplify that issue and garner some further attention. And it resulted in a bill getting filed in the legislature to add LGBTQ folks to the list of groups protected by Alaska hate crime statutes. I don't know the status of that bill, but you know, that was an example of something where I feel like I had used my blog for something that had a real life kind of implication that was something I cared about and that mattered. And the fourth realization I had was that, you know, that speaking up in this way and using my voice in the way that I felt and feel compelled to use it was just who I was, that I didn't really have a choice. It was just like when I was a little kid, I wasn't trying to make waves. I just was not capable of not calling out bullshit when I saw it. And my final realization was about fear. And I realized that, yes, I was afraid and ashamed in a lot of ways, but I wasn't ashamed or afraid enough to stop talking, because I knew that the way that I used my time and my voice is the only rebuke to fear. The instinct to call things the way I see them overpowers any fear I have. It overpowers self-preservation. It overpowers any in self-serving instinct I might have to make money or get a certain job or keep a certain job or earn the approval of certain people. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. I don't actually would not advise living this way, but I realized this was just who I was and that this was my path. Because a critical point too is that, you know, we don't need the First Amendment for easy speech, for speech that makes people comfortable, speech that the government finds acceptable, speech that's loyal to people in power, speech that's benign or courteous. You really need the First Amendment for speech that makes government uncomfortable, that challenges people in power, that uses four-letter words to vent anger and frustration. The First Amendment exists to protect that kind of speech, challenging, offensive, disloyal, difficult speech. And I'll just leave you for this segment of the evening, and I'll stop talking at everybody and hopefully get some Q&A and dialogue going. But I'll leave you with one final important thought about the time of upheaval we're in right now. You know, it's just, we've had this unbelievable 2 weeks. I mean, in 2 weeks, we've had Ruth Bader Ginsburg die. I'm wearing my dissent earrings, dissent collar earrings. My friend Jason gave these to me. I'm wearing them in her honor. We had her die. We had this insane debate. We had the Trump taxes. Then we had Melania saying, fuck Christmas. Then we had Trump getting corona and going to the hospital. I mean, all in the course of just 2 weeks. And it's a time of enormous upheaval. We had the debate, which was like, you know, insane. But, you know, I think everyone who's been through government upheaval, and I read a lot about, I read a lot in general, but I read a lot specifically about authoritarian states and sort of erosion of democracy is one of the things I'm interested in reading a lot about. And everyone who's been through kind of a government upheaval where there is a democratic kind of breakdown of sorts says the same things. You know, daily life goes on, right? Bad news keeps happening. Sometimes it affects you personally, sometimes it doesn't, but there isn't this one magic moment where you have to just like spring into action. There's not some, you know, kind of go time, like zombie apocalypse, here it's coming, like it's time to just leap into action. It's a series of daily things and actions, series of daily words and actions you do. And everybody says this, you know, from Sri Lanka to Hungary to Turkey to Belarus to Russia to everywhere around the world where democracy is under threat, everyone says the same things. You have to fight back, you have to speak up, and you have to honor your values every day. Because if you don't do that, you lose the only tools you have to push back against autocracy. So that's sort of the framework of everything that I have to say on this topic. And, you know, I think it's something we don't think about in our daily lives very much, and that at least until this administration, we've all taken for granted. But, you know, it is a huge privilege to be able to express your opinions without fear of retribution, be it to your liberty or to your financial, your livelihood. And we are no longer safe to do that really in this country necessarily. And so that's why I just think it's a timely topic, and it's important to kind of keep exercising these constitutional rights, making a record of what's happening. Even if it doesn't actually result in any real life impact, there is value in simply saying these things and simply making a record for history and saying, you know, I object to what's going on here and here's why. And I'm not going to go quietly and pretend, I'm not going to sit here and pretend everything's fine and just sit here in silence for the next however many years while this insanity continues to go on. So that's sort of the gist of the lecture part. And I do see some questions in the chat box and stuff, but my Zoom proficiency is like not that amazing. And I'm kind of wondering if maybe Kenny or somebody can help me with some of the questions in terms of reading them to me or something. I'm going to try to like do some tech tinkering here and hopefully see some chats.
All I see in the chat so far is a link that was shared by Jeff Loftus.
Okay.
So if anybody wants to go to that link, otherwise I think people could, maybe we can just try people asking questions and see what happens. And if not, then there is a raise your hand option in, oh, there's a question. Okay. The question is, how do you feel about Trump being reelected in 2020?
Oh my God. Well, I gotta say, I'm doing some Googling while we're talking because I want to make sure that I actually I see some things in the chat and I want to make sure that I understand everything. So,
they might be sending you a chat directly also.
Yeah, no, I see some of those too. So I will say this about Trump being elected and reelected. I don't say this often out loud because I don't want to be a downer or a naysayer, or it gets people mad. But one time I've actually, of the few times I've said this out loud, people get upset and mad at me. But my personal opinion is on November 9th, 2016, I cried. And I cried because I knew I thought it was quite likely that we would be stuck with this man for 8 years. And that's just because the power of the incumbency is very strong. It's hard. There aren't a lot of presidents that really just have one term. I mean, it's not unheard of, but it's not as common as keeping the incumbency. And so I knew just statistically it was pretty likely that he was going to be reelected, and I'm still not totally sure of that. I think it's a chance. I think there's a good chance he will be. I think the numbers just, and I think possibly the same is true of our congressional delegation as well. It's easy to be in an echo chamber and think, well, this is also ridiculous. How could 40% of the country support what's going on? But they do, and they vote. And so, it really just kind of depends. I think there is a good chance that he will be reelected. And I have accepted that, and I accepted it a long time ago. So if he isn't reelected, I'll be thrilled. But I think I've come to terms with the strong possibility that it could happen. So some people I see are asking me to update me on my case. So my lawsuit with the state. It's still going on. Things were going a little bit slowly with the ACLU, so I had another plaintiff's attorney take over for them, and they are doing sort of a little bit more nuts and bolts litigation stuff, and so the case is kind of moving along in ways that I kind of wish it had done earlier on. There are some very interesting legal issues to be dealt with in the case about whether, for example, whether these resignation requests themselves violated the First Amendment, before we even get to my blog, whether it was constitutional to essentially demand everybody, swear allegiance to Dunleavy, otherwise lose their job. Is that itself a First Amendment violation? That's one question. Who is a policymaker at the state who's subject to being fired for their constitutional beliefs, who isn't? These are all sort of legal issues that affect the whole state workforce as a whole. And, in my litigation, one of the things I'm hoping to get is some orders from the federal judge, it's in federal court, that say these things. I want to see orders come out of my case that protect future state and current state employees. I want state employees to not have to live in fear of their Facebook being stalked, their Twitter being stalked, their jobs being under threat every 4 years when they're not political appointees. So I would like to see some orders come out of this case on that. And the ACLU did a great job with the beginning of the litigation, and I'm really grateful for all that work. But I think, they're a busy organization. They have a lot of cases, and I think, I'm a lawyer as a client, and that makes it a little bit hard because I have, my ideas about how everything should go. And so, yeah, Mark Choate and another woman named Amanda Harbor down on the Kenai are handling it now. and they're just kind of like moving things along a little bit more quickly. And so it's in discovery, and there should be some motions filed soon, and hopefully some orders and things coming out of it. So it's litigation is slow, and it's just kind of, it's plodding along. Anyway. Should I do the questions? Because I'm seeing some really interesting questions come up in the chat.
It's up to you.
Okay. Okay, I'm looking to, there's some to everyone, and then there's some that are just to me. So I'm going to do the ones to everyone. So which action of the Trump administration have you found the most alarming in terms of the long-term erosion of rights and democracy? That is an interesting question. It is hard to identify just one. There are so many to choose from. But I think, you know, one of the, certainly the scariest one, I think, was his willingness to deploy federal force, or his attempt to use the military to quell domestic unrest in American cities. And it was interesting how the military refused to do that, which is why he had to go to his own DHS to do that. So that's really scary. That's the kind of thing you see, you know, in a real dictatorship. Force against your own citizens, I think, is very alarming. The most alarming by far, from a constitutional standpoint, to me, is his refusal to commit to a peaceful transition of power, and his constant denigration of the electoral process, you know, throwing that process into chaos, sowing doubt on it, where there's no evidence that doubt needs to be sown, and it's clearly a self-interested you know, tactic, is very anti-democratic. And so I would say those two things: the use of force, the use of federal force in American cities against American citizens, and the mockery he's trying to make out of the election. Because if you don't have confidence in the electoral system, then you lose democracy. And so he's a very big danger to that, to democracy in that way, I think. So someone else asked, what is the best process for speaking out? Is contacting a senator consistently the best means of voicing dissent? You know, I think there's no one way. I mean, I recognize that, you know, I've amassed this platform, and so I have an opportunity to you know, a bigger megaphone maybe than some. But I do think constantly contacting elected officials, and of course, is a very legitimate form of civic engagement. You know, volunteering in organizations that you care about, like, you know, volunteering in your kids' schools. I mean, there's all sorts of ways to, and all sorts of people in this community do all of that stuff a lot more than I do. It's like all about living your values. And sometimes speaking out doesn't have to be in words, it can be in actions. And so, you know, like I'm on the board of AWARE, and I really care about, you know, domestic sexual assault and domestic violence issues. And so, you know, that board service is my way of speaking out against that. I mean, I think everybody can find their own niche, you know, but it is important, I think, to find what you care about and to find a way to express that. And it doesn't necessarily need to be, you know, a loud performative thing on the internet. You know, it can be something a lot more quiet and intimate than that. But I do think all of those little actions and tiny acts of resistance and pushback, they all build up to create a better society. Okay, someone said, thanks for your advocacy for free speech, Libby. I work with a lot of teachers. How would you advise teachers in this moment? Many I work with are caught between advocating for equity and yet feeling pressure to be apolitical. Jobs are on the line while they are doing double duty in the pandemic. That is a really hard question and an interesting question, because here's how I feel about that. I actually don't think that what we are experiencing right now is politics, exactly as that term has previously been understood. And I think one of the things people are really struggling with is catching up, having our minds catch up to really what's happening. It's very disorienting, but I don't think it's politics in the way we've understood that. I think what we're witnessing now is a lot more than that. It's a startling lack of empathy from our elected leaders, specifically the president, to a lesser extent the governor. A shocking, just a shocking lack of empathy. That we're in a culture of meanness, and that's a tone that's coming from the top. And there's human rights abuses happening under our noses here. And I think, there is a focus for, when I think about my kids in school and what I want them to hear and the messages I want them to get, when I heard them listen to that debate, I just wanted to make them leave the room because I didn't want them to hear two adults speaking to each other like that. So I think for teachers, it's important as always to teach kindness, to teach, like principles of quote unquote social justice and equity. These are human rights issues, right? And framing them like that, instead of framing them as, left versus right and political, to me, it's just not the same thing. And I realize that it's scary and risky for people to take that attitude and that approach. But I think it starts with kindness. And honestly, like some of the most basic things that you would teach a child are things that, our president has not learned. You don't lie, you don't cheat, you don't steal, you don't bully people, you don't, you treat people with kindness, you say kind words, you don't make fun of them, you don't make fun of their looks and their disabilities. I mean, these are just basic things that this man cannot manifest. And so it's hard to raise a child in a country where this is the example that's being set for them. And I think, framing it more as, here's an example of kindness versus, this is an example of how you don't want to act. Unfortunately, the person who sits in the highest office in our government right now is an internet troll and a complete and total lying bully. And these are just values you don't want your kids to have. And I think just teachers are with our kids every day, and you can inculcate some of those values without being political about them, because I think that's the point we're at right now. We have to we have to step back from thinking about this as a political moment and more of a human, moral, ethical sort of philosophical moment of some kind. So, oh my God, I've got 10 new messages here. Hold on. Okay. Any mental health tips from your mom for coping with the nonstop chaos coming from the federal government? Oh yeah, my mom's a big character on my blog, which I like to post videos of her when she's visiting, because she's a psychiatrist and she does give me a lot of good mental health tips. And she's having a really busy time during this pandemic because it's a psychiatric pandemic in a lot of ways. But her advice is to just turn off the news. I don't follow her advice very much, but her advice is to turn off the news, get a lot of sleep, and turn to the things that make you feel better. That was a really good piece of advice. She said, what makes you feel better. The kinds of things that give you comfort, whether it's yoga or whether it's running or if it's, knitting or it's cooking or whatever. Like, turn to those things more and more so that you can feel centered and you can feel peace. So that was one really good piece of advice. Anyway, let's see here. What else? Oh, yeah. What is your legal perspective on the necessity of the Electoral College in 2020 and in relation to the Constitution? Oh boy. Well, I think the Electoral College is not really serving the initial purposes it was meant to serve necessarily. you know, at the time it was created, it had its purpose, and now I think it's probably outlived that purpose. There's something called the National Popular Vote Compact, which is essentially a state-by-state legislative effort to try to get states to, by statute, promise their electoral votes to whoever wins the popular vote in each state, so that essentially thereby kind of circumventing the Electoral College. I think that is sort of the best hope for an end to the Electoral College. It's not going to happen with a constitutional amendment because there's not the consensus that we need in the country to amend the Constitution. And the fact that the Constitution was amended 27 times or so still blows my mind, because to think that that could even happen once in the current climate we're in is just I think we're stuck with the Electoral College, just like we're stuck with Citizens United. You know, unless we get a constitutional amendment that undoes it, the only way around it really is the National Popular Vote Compact. Are we ever going to see another constitutional makeup blog post? Yeah, I have like 12 of them where I do makeup tutorials and also explain some piece of the Constitution at the same time. I haven't done one in a while because I'm running out of little chunks of the Constitution that are amenable to makeup, but I might start to do cases. So we'll see. I might start to reduce some basic Supreme Court cases to mascara and lipstick. I don't know. I got to do some work into that. I feel like I may have hit my limit with chunks of the Constitution that are that work well with the makeup tutorial format, but I'm going to keep working on that. So let's see what else. I have 6 new messages down here. Hang on. What do you think it's going to take to get our country back on track, however long that may take? Oh man. Well, I think the idea that we're just going to go quote unquote back to normal after this is a little bit of a pipe dream. Of course, you know, this last 4 years has been a big awakening for me and a lot of people for whom it hasn't necessarily been. You know, there are, you know, Black and Indigenous people of color have been telling all of the rest of us for 400 years how messed up this country is, right? And only in the past 4 years have some of us just started to be like, oh wait, you're right about that. So, you know, everything going back to normal is not really ideal. I think we need to move the Overton window and start to think about, you know, whole new ways of existing. I mean, we need a whole new way of interacting, of relating to the climate, of relating to each other. I think we need like massive healthcare overhaul. I mean, there's just these huge, enormous tasks in front of us as a, not just a country, but as a planet. And hopefully whoever has the job of president next, God willing, and it's not Trump again, will begin to undo some of the damage he's done. You know, the president sets the tone for the country, for better or worse, and the tone he has set is incredibly lacking in empathy and incredibly anti-democratic and incredibly unscrupulous. And at least I think, you know, getting Trump out of office is the very least thing that needs to happen to get things back on track. So that's what I think about that. I mean, I think it's going to be hard and it's not going to happen overnight. Let's see. I'm looking at the thread here for questions I can answer, because there's some of it's like can be a Facebook thing. Okay. Thank you for blow up your TV. That's good advice. Given your children's debate listening session, would you admit that you must listen to everyone, trust nothing, and question everything? Yeah, pretty much I would admit that. I think that's good. I mean, I think it's important that kids have an array of examples that they see about how to behave, how not to behave, what your values are. But yes, critical thinking is an important skill set. And I think certainly that debate, I think even children, you know, I think my son said, if I were in this debate, I would just throw up my hands and say, dude, I'm going to go get a piece of pizza. I cannot deal with this right now. So even a 10-year-old recognized kind of how ridiculous it was. And I think that's good. I think kids need exposure to all kinds of people and things. And I do think you have to listen to everyone, trust nothing, and question everything. I think trust nothing might be a little cynical, but yeah, I think that's generally good advice. Oh, gee. Okay. Oh, man. Okay. What are my thoughts on Dan Sullivan? Not a fan, you guys. I'm not a fan. And the reason I'm not a fan is because he does not seem to have any guiding principles or ideals that belong to him that aren't just a mirror of his own ambition and his own self-interest. And maybe that's true of every politician, and I'm just, you know, a leftist and I can't see it from the other side. But, you know, I don't think he's somebody with a great deal of character, and I think we need more character in government. You know, I don't think that of Lisa Murkowski, for example, even though I know a lot of people, I don't agree with how she votes a lot of the time, but I do think she is a decent statesperson, and I think she has the public interest in the forefront of her mind. I don't think that of Dan Sullivan. I think he has his own interest in the forefront of his mind. And so, yeah, I'm not a fan of him. What would I say to young people, students in the state to keep them invested in staying in Alaska with the current economic forecast? That is a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think the country is in so much upheaval right now, and especially with the pandemic, it's hard to even see beyond that to the next stage of things. But I think I have this idea in my mind that, like, with all the wildfires happening on the West Coast, down south, and, you know, the increasingly hot summers, and that Alaska's going to kind of maybe become some sort of climate change refuge. I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not, but I do think we're going to turn around from some of this. I think we need to get beyond oil, and that it's going to take a lot of innovation to do that. We're going to have to transition from being, you know, we've had 40 years as a resource extraction, a resource colony, and those days are running out. And I think what I would say to young people is stay and be part of the solution, be part of Alaska's next iteration, because I think we have to have young people here. We can't have brain drain and we can't have flight. We need young people here to build the state up to its next phase, whatever that phase looks like, however it looks. We need that energy. We need that creativity. We need something besides, you know, pipeline, old school cowboy stuff. Like, that's just not going to cut it anymore. And so we need people with new vision. And so what I would say to young people who are like, I don't want to stay there, the economy sucks, it's like, well, stay here and work on it and make it the place that you want to see. It's like manifest, right? It's how, you know, it's the whole be the change kind of a thing. And those are big risks to take because, you know, you can't necessarily afford to do that. That's a sort of an idealistic way of looking at it. But I think, you know, if we don't have young people staying here, and if we have brain drain from the state, then really all is lost with Alaska. And so I would say that they're the best salvation for the state. So yeah, and someone wrote, Alaska has an opportunity to be a global leader in social justice, renewable energy infrastructure, and climate adaptation. I totally agree to that on that. Social media has dramatically changed how speech is expressed in our country in a very quick period of time. Do you think social media is a net benefit or a net detriment to society? If you had a magic wand and could reinvent social media, what would you do? You know, I think it's both. I really think it's both. I think it is a very powerful tool, and like any tool, it is and can be misused. I think it has caused enormous damage in a lot of ways. I also think it has caused amazing benefits. It's democratized, it's brought the world together in ways that were incomprehensible even 15 years ago. It has brought awareness to issues none of us would see. It, for example, you know, when I think about Black Lives Matter and George Floyd and police brutality, I mean, the things that we see on video and that can race around the internet in minutes, you know, are exposing other people's experiences in ways that we would never see. You know, like anything else, it's vulnerable to malfeasance, it's vulnerable to bad actors. But I think, you know, when used safely and properly and as a tool, it can be amazing. It can be an amazing democratizing tool. But it's a double-edged sword. And so I don't think it's either a net benefit or a net detriment. I think it's something that's here with us to stay. It's a way of communicating that's not going away. And it's a giant, powerful thing that we have to learn how to harness for good and minimize the use of it for evil, because it's here with us as a way to communicate indefinitely. And I don't think I would go back and get rid of it, because I think overall, it's a form of progress, even though it's got a lot of, you know, obvious dangers and pitfalls. Someone asked me if I can speak to the voter suppression tactics that are being used by the Republicans during this elections process. Oh man, you know, I used to be an elections attorney. Well, I still kind of am, but I was for a long time. And one time a Republican guy that was on a working group, a legislator at the time, he said to me, you know, everyone in my party says if more people vote, we'll lose, but I want us to vote a lot. And I don't understand why they don't want people to vote. And I'm like, dude, you're not supposed to say that out loud. Like, that's not the, like, no, you're not supposed to say the quiet part out loud. But so I think, you know, to a large extent, the right knows that the way that they can win elections is by voter suppression. And I think, you know, I think it's terrible. And the only way to resist it is to do everything you can to make sure you are registered to vote, that all your friends are registered to vote, that they have a way of getting to the polls, that they have a way of getting their absentee ballot mailed in. I mean, I have to say, at least in Alaska, in my experience, I have faith in the Alaska Division of Elections. I think it's a well-run organization, and I think there's really good, well-meaning people there. Does that mean things happen perfectly all the time? No. And in an election, you're expected to run it perfectly. There's like no room for error, and people don't notice when things go right. They only notice when things go wrong. And it's an enormous undertaking. But I have nothing but good things to say about our state division of elections. I do think they do, in many ways, the very best they can, notwithstanding all of the shenanigans that can happen in the litigation, and certainly, you know, some fights over the ballots this year and things like that. I've watched that from the side and just been like, oh man, I really miss my colleagues, but I'm really glad I'm in the middle of that. I think those kinds of tactics aren't going to go away unless there is, you know, frankly, a Congress that is willing to take some action that ensures that can't happen, that these things can't happen. And, you know, gerrymandering and redistricting is one of the biggest ways that voter suppression happens. And there's not a lot that Congress can necessarily do about that. So if I can speak to those tactics, I would just say, I think they're terrible. And I think the only way to fight them is to, you know, urge Congress to pass, you know, voting rights legislation, you know, comprehensive polling place access reform, and also to just vote and make sure that you're aware of what's on the ballot and the deadlines and things like that. Because you have to stay engaged, because democracy is not a spectator sport. You got to participate or it doesn't work. Let's see, a couple more questions. Can you comment on AK government requirement for signature requirement on mail-in ballots? Okay, so I'm not following that as closely as I should be, only because I don't have to follow it anymore. But there is, so I know that in statute, there was a witness signature requirement in statute that you have to have the ballot envelope witnessed. And I believe that is currently being challenged by the ACLU and the Native American Rights Fund in court right now. I think, and this is the gap that I'm missing. I believe that there was a Senate bill or a bill during the last session that was passed that allowed the lieutenant governor perhaps to waive some of these requirements due to COVID, and maybe that's the issue. I have to be honest, I don't know. I'm not following it as closely as perhaps I should be. I do know that that witnessing requirement is in statute. And so it does require some form of legislative action. I think it's possible the legislature said the lieutenant governor could waive it and then he decided not to waive it, and that's what the court fight's about. I'm not sure. But I think in general that requirement is onerous. It's probably not necessary, and it discourages people from voting remotely because it effectively requires a second person to be involved in your vote. And so it's, you know, it's burdensome. And one of the arguments in the case that I understand it is that it's unconstitutional. You know, it's an unconstitutional infringement of ballot access. And so that'll be interesting to see what the court says about that. I think there were possibly some good claims out there. And I think around the country, some of them have not, you know, done sort of, you know, there are other jurisdictions that have done this, had these rules overturned. So I certainly think it's cumbersome, and, you know, we'll see what happens in court. Let's see, what other questions? Yeah. All right, well, I don't see many more questions.
Excellent. We are fast approaching the 8 o'clock hour, and it was fabulous to have Libby come and share with us this evening. If we could give her just a virtual round of applause. This was such a good discussion and so interesting. Libby, I believe we can find you on social media. Is that correct?
You can.
All right. So if people have questions, comments, further musings or wonderings, they can look you up on Facebook. And of course you have a blog, right? So
I do. And I just want to say one more comment. Someone wrote, maybe we should spend more time listening. Maybe we should spend more time listening to the people who have been here since time immemorial. And I could not agree with that more. I just want to say that. I've sat here talking, blabbing for an hour, and I really agree with that. So I don't want my 1 hour of blabbing to diminish from that comment, because I agree with that 100%. All right, that's all I got to say, guys.
All right, thank you, Libby, for accepting our invitation to come and chat. It was awesome.
Thank you guys for having me so much. I hope it was informative and not too boring.
Absolutely. And next week, Sonia Nagorski will be discussing plastics and pollution in Juneau and around Alaska. So that'll also be an interesting topic. Sonia, I think I saw you on the chat list tonight. It will be good to see you next week. So I'm signing off. Thanks, Libby. Thank you, Kenny.
Take care. Bye.